Well, hello and welcome to the season finale of the TRG webinar series. I'm Kahlil Philander. I'm an assistant professor at Washington State University. Joining me is Sally Gainsbury, as always, a professor at the University of Sydney. And this week we have a very interesting guest and one who can speak about a topic that we've focused on a few different times in different episodes, but from a very different perspective. And so we're very excited to have them here, and I will pass Sally Gainsbury the microphone to introduce him.
Thank you very much, Kahlil. I'm very pleased that Stephen Hanna has been able to join us today. He's dialing in from Australia, where he's based. And Stephen is, among other hats he wears, the managing director, the director of global strategy and partnerships at ESIC, which is a Esports Integrity Commission. So we're going to get into a topic that we've touched on, as you've mentioned, Kahlil, in a couple of different episodes, but really get into the nitty gritty. This is our last TRG of the season. And as always, if you're watching live, pop your questions into the chat nice and early so we can get to them, because we've got a lot of different topics that Stephen is knowledgeable to talk on. So before we get into it, Stephen, I'm going to ask you to give a definition of esports and what it means from an ESIC kind of perspective, what aspects you're looking at, and whether things have changed over the years in a global definition of what's in and what's out of esports.
Awesome. Well, first, thanks very much for having me here, guys. Really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to unpacking this with you guys. There's a lot of interesting developments in esports in the domain that we've been discussing. Well, good first question. And to set context, I think generally speaking, people have an idea of what esports is, at least in their own minds. But just so that we're all on the same page, esports by definition is an umbrella term, and it often refers to a plethora of different game titles that have made their way into the phenomenon of being played in a competitive format in a way that facilitates, prizing and tournament structure and teams and so on, much like sports. And so when people say esports, sometimes they think esports is a single item on the line right next to, soccer and football and all that sort of thing. But the important delineation is that esports is more like saying sports. So when you have esports and you have an athlete in esports, no two athletes competing are necessarily the same. You can have an athlete that competes in a particular genre of game that is really proficient, and you can have other athletes that are in completely different genres. And they, if they were to move over between the esports, it'd be a brand new experience for them. So much like it is with sport. And so I think that has been the general basic understanding, but the understanding at law has changed from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There are many jurisdictions that have, that still don't recognize esports as a sport. And so esports does not have access in those particular jurisdictions to the things that, normal sporting codes would, things like a sport controlling body, and all of the attributes that come along with a sport controlling body, like, for example, a national federation to seed into, international competition like IOC competition and so on, but also things like expedited visa, traffic for like moving players around from different countries to country. In some jurisdictions that there's a conflict of understanding in esports. Like, for example, in the tax law, it will say that esports is sporting income. Esports income is sporting income, but in everywhere else in legislation, it will just say that esports is an entertainment, a spectator sort of entertainment phenomenon, as opposed to a recognized sport in the country. And so there is, on that side of things, legally from a definitional perspective, there is still that fragmentation globally. And that definitely provides for a lot of challenges. And we see these challenges crystallize in many different places, but I won't go down the rabbit hole too far at this point in time. But yeah, that's really basically an overview, but I'm happy to expand as we go along.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of curious about like market structure in this area. And the reason why I'm curious is because, the way you framed it as esports is sports, but this is going to be it seems like a very important question for me, but I'm sure it's a very dumb question from your perspective. But nobody owns regular sports as we know them. But Blizzard own StarCraft, or I'm going to give bad examples because I don't know what leagues, but that one I'm fairly confident on. How does that change the dynamic of the way that these markets are set up from a market structure way? And are there implications of that in trying to create some sort of unified perspective or unified lobby around the policy issues that relate to this area?
Yeah, no, of course. You correctly mentioned that, nobody, if you're going to take a football out onto the field and kick it around, nobody's going to come after you and say, well, hold on, no, I own this concept and you can't do this casual game, or you can't do this, casual tournament. Whereas, of course, as you correctly mentioned in esports, the intellectual property holder has the ultimate power. And so the dynamic in the superstructure that creates is extremely compelling when it comes to dealing with issues associated with industry structure and ecosystem development and all that sort of thing. And so almost you could say at the most simple level, if you were to summarize what the implication is that esports exists at the behest of the intellectual property holder. In other words, an entire sector of esports could be shut down at a moment's notice should that suit the intellectual property holder's interest. And that in fact has happened in the past, where we've had entire teams that entire tournaments or entire leagues that have been decimated overnight after a publisher decided that it was no longer feasible to run that particular title, and so all of the underlying investment and all the underlying infrastructure associated with that particular title just disappeared overnight, or it had no purpose or credibility or reason to exist anymore. And so when you have an environment that is really heavily dependent on this sort of benevolent IP holder sitting at the top and handing down essentially the ability to have this competition happen, you really need to be careful with the way that you invest in esports, because you in some cases have no capability of certainty that just tomorrow your investment would be viable and still capable of operating. And that's actually been one of the biggest bugbears in the esports industry for a very, very long time. Commercialization has been something that's challenged many stakeholders for a significant amount of time. And one of the examples that I could give is with a team like FaZe Clan, for example. While the issues associated with like FaZe Clan don't necessarily stem directly from one publisher exercising their power, so perhaps not necessarily relevant, but to illustrate the difficulty and viability of sort of commercial viability of creating a team. So when you create a team in for example, a franchise league in any sport that has a sort of a franchise model, you buy a franchise slot, you have a team, you have certainty, and you have a level of a guarantee that you're going to be able to run tournaments on multiple years. So esports got to a point where it was, and this is sort of coming back maybe 5-6 years, where we had a lot of market growth, a lot of capital injection into esports at a rate that was year on year almost doubling from an injection capacity perspective. And we had a team, for example, that went public in FaZe Clan. It went public, I think, for like $725 million market cap. And that's massive. This is just a team. It's not a publisher. It's not it's literally a team that that's playing in these tournaments at the behest of the publisher creating the ecosystem. And so what we've seen is over the years since that, I think it was like 5 years time, from 725 mil. Just recently, like literally maybe in October, like October 21st, I think it was, around there, announcements came out that FaZe Clan was acquired for $17 million. And so you can see the illustration there, really, really salient. You go from 725 million market cap on the SPAC, then you end up being acquired for $17 million a few years later. And that is a really, really vivid illustration of the commercial challenges that are associated with esports. And it's largely because there is so much fragmentation in the industry in terms of the way that it's built, in terms of the way that the money flows. And to unpack that, we'd probably need 2 or 3 hours to sit and chat through all those issues.
Well, and that's something I wanted to pick up, and also your earlier comment about players not just being able to switch from game to game, which is obviously, if you play soccer, you can't just pick up like a rugby ball. I'll use as an example. Pardon the Australianisms there, but similarly with esports. And one thing I'm really curious about is kind of the grassroots growth. So we obviously see governments around the world investing in making, sports available for young children, and parents actively encouraging their children to play various sports and join a team. And there's obviously the physical activity, which is slightly different in esports, but we don't see as much, or there have been some. I know that sort of Singapore has looking at growing teams, and there have been some creating teams, but I'm just trying to get at that sort of grassroots, which is both the people who become spectators of esports, because not everyone who plays basketball as a kid is going to end up or has any aspirations to end up playing basketball professionally. But what is happening at that kind of grassroots to get the people initially involved in esports, and what is that transition to playing in, like, are there amateur, Saturday morning esports competitions, like we've got Saturday morning basketball, and then, mid-tier, and then finally up to the professional? Or is it, growing the spectators? What's going on in that grassroots engagement?
Yeah, it's a really good question as well. And I think, with grassroots, the great thing about esports, or the thing that I think esports is esports' biggest strength, is accessibility. You don't need to go to a field to play. You don't need to go to a tennis court. You don't need to go to a cricket pitch. You literally roll out of bed, walk a few steps, and jump on your PC, and you're in the game. And so that lends itself to a very vibrant grassroots community. However, because of the aforementioned challenges with commercialization at the top end and at the mid level, you find that a lot of people or a lot of providers struggle to commercialize the bottom, the grassroots tier. Because let's look at the commercial model here, right? So I want to participate in an esport tournament. I've already made the purchase of the game to the publisher, so I have the tools that I need to actually play. I, in this illustration, have the PC to play. Why should I? How do I become a customer of a provider that is providing, like, grassroots tournaments and things like that? So what you end up finding is a lot of the grassroots industry is free to play. So tournament platforms like ESEA, that's an ESL subsidiary platform, and other tournaments like tournament platforms like Face It, also part of EFG Group. They facilitate these sort of free to play grassroots tournaments, and then it's basically up to tournament organizers almost on a local level to put together these tournaments and facilitate play. The issue is, though, that and this is sort of when I'm moving past your question, Sally, a little bit into the risk that comes along with it, and I guess the issue with the accessibility of all of this, and the accessibility of really good infrastructure like Face It or like ESCA or these different tournament platforms, the issue with that is that there is no real disparity between a professional tournament and the data that comes out of a professional tournament, and then a grassroots tournament and data that comes out of grassroots tournament. And so from an ESIC perspective, as the Integrity Commission, when we look at corruption in the industry, we find that because of the plethora of grassroots tournaments and the data that comes out of them, there is corruption mainly targeted at the grassroots level of the esports industry. Because again, like you can grab a match between two kids that is two teams of amateur players. One team, for example, has been told to fix, and there are odds offered on that match because the same data points are available as they are for the big tournaments, and so because that's just one grassroots tournament out of hundreds of tournaments a day. And, unless you have visibility of the odds movements and things like that, you just will never know that that's happening. So that's, I guess, the challenge that comes along, the integrity challenge that comes along with the accessibility of esports. But on the flip side, of course, back to your original question, the grassroots part of the industry is quite it's a natural part of gaming. So, gaming being social first, and then sort of the competitive tier straight on top of it, being accessible through these different platforms that exist out there.
Well, and since you brought the conversation to integrity, I'll pick it up there. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind just giving us a sense of what the integrity issues look like in this space, and then maybe we can talk about the data-related things that you've been working on as well. But just at a high level, what are the integrity issues? Is it doping? Is it match fixing? Or does it look a lot like what we see in other sports?
Yeah. Look, it's pretty much identical to what you see in other sports. However, the way that they manifest is incredibly different, almost unrecognizable. So I'll give you a few examples. So to preface this, I'll just say that, with ESIC, we work and have MOUs with pretty much every major law enforcement body. We've made referrals, worked with the FBI, worked with Interpol, worked with police locally and at a jurisdiction level, and facilitated exchanges of information that have led to arrests and charges and things like that. So this is serious stuff. It's not people often think, oh, esports, a bunch of kids playing games, but no, this gets to a level of organized crime, and so primarily organized crime sits in the realm of match fixing or betting fraud, in other words, and betting fraud is extremely evasive. If you don't have the correct insight in terms of the data from different stakeholders, you will struggle to actually be able to see betting fraud happen. And frankly, even our view of betting fraud is but a segment of the potential black market that's out there, or the potential market for that. So match fixing, betting fraud is definitely a key component of corruption. But you also have doping, right? And with ESIC, we actually administer anti-doping testing at all of our major events for our members. But we definitely, but in returning to my earlier, representation that similar issues just manifesting differently, we don't test for example, WADA prohibited substances, because as you could probably appreciate, steroid is not going to do much for you sitting and playing Counter-Strike or a tournament, any sort of game really. And so what we look for are sort of prohibited substances that sit on our prohibited substance list, which was formulated after a study looking at sort of stimulants or reaction time modification through the use of substance. And so things like, for example, Adderall are interesting to us. Or non-therapeutic use Adderall, are interesting to us. So that for example is again similar to sports, but also different. But then there are other ecosystem risks that come out of sort of the woodworks after a while. Like, for example, because again, esports is incredibly fragmented and it has very little centralized governance and regulation. And again, it's not to say that it needs it. There are transient risks that come out, like for example with talent agent management. Players, playing for a little bit as a professional, then deciding that they are now certified to be a talent agent because they have a track record as a professional player. And so then they go and do some really bad contracts for a bunch of other kids or a bunch of other players and sort of, lock them into ridiculous clauses and ridiculous buyouts and all this sort of thing. And even to the point where we have, we've seen talent agents that represent both the team and the player. So, you can reconcile that for me. There's just so many issues there, and there's nobody looking at this, right? So in jurisdictions that don't have like a talent agent licensing system, like for example California does, you have issues with that. It becomes something that is a point of contention and a point of risk for people entering the industry or participating in the industry that don't know any better. So these are all of the different sort of areas, and of course there are many more, but at least at a surface level, these are sort of areas that we look at. And I'm assuming, Sally, maybe you have like something that's come to mind from your area of interest from a risk perspective.
Yeah, and there's lots of different risks there, and we've got one audience question that I'm going to get to, but I guess just picking up on that comment, my question is around the betting and who's conducting the betting, because there's obviously the risk from the integrity point of view, and that's on the sort of the sports side of things, but there's also the risk in terms of the betting side. We have seen some regulated sites offer odds on esports, but a lot have stayed away from it, which is particularly in Australia, which, obviously we have a huge betting ecosystem, and there's a lot of money and a lot of players. And the fact that we haven't seen a lot of wagering operators offer markets on esports, I think is quite telling that they are not convinced of the integrity of the market. But my concern then, and a lot of people watching do have concerns, particularly around young people and this kind of idea that young people are more likely to be the ones betting on esports, which I think is true to an extent. You can probably comment on that. But so my question is around the extent to which people can bet on esports. Are they doing it mostly through regulated sites, or what I would suspect there's a huge illegal market of operators who aren't acting according to the regulation in which they're acting in, so they're offshore, acting in contravention of local jurisdictions, and potentially accepting all sorts of currency, from crypto to skins, and so they essentially offer an entry point for underage gambling, and they might not care about the integrity. They might themselves actually not be offering the game in a fair and regulated way. So is it out of concern to esports that they're essentially putting a product and all this data out into the world without any concern that it's furthering illegal and underage gambling?
Yeah, so that's really good set of observations. I think if we start with the premise that for publishers, this is often a marketing exercise, esports, and I guess that explains a lot of the lack of infrastructure and sort of foresight and forethought into the gambling sphere. In fact, it's only recently that Riot Games, even, for example, allowed, I think it was March this year, that Riot Games started allowing teams to affiliate with betting companies. And so it kind of gives you a picture. And Riot Games is really out, like they're a leader in the space in terms of self-integrity, self-regulation and integrity. They have really, really good frameworks and really good people that they've put in place at that organization. But the illustration and the reason why I brought that observation up is that it really shows you from an esports perspective that the industry, at least at the IP holder level, hasn't really grappled with the implications of the betting side. That's just going to come. So regardless of what you do, it's going to come along. And so back to your original sort of the way you phrased your observations and your question. In Australia, as a case study, for example, we don't see bettors going through legal means to engage with esports. But also, to be fair, in some states that offer gambling licenses, esports either hasn't been or was only recently introduced as a valid betting proposition that is capable of being associated with a license issued in that state. I'll give you an example. So in New South Wales, the Department of Liquor and Gaming only recently gazetted in, and I say recently, but it's pre-COVID, but it just feels like it was recently. They gazetted in a provision essentially in one of the schedules that allowed esports betting on tournaments that were run by ESIC members and sanctioned by the Esports Integrity Commission, which is us. And so that is sort of and that was a really pragmatic and frankly a good approach, because you're really limiting it to very, very high level events that are well produced, that we're looking at and watching at all times. And so we can actually inform the regulator if there are any issues, inform law enforcement if there are any issues, and so on. But what we find is, especially throughout the COVID period, there was a lot of betting that was done. And I wouldn't say, I guess you could say black market sort of style betting, but these operations propped up out of nowhere. Because if you can imagine with me, or if you can remember with me, betting volume in every traditional sport went almost down to zero because we had no physical events. And so that volume went somewhere. That volume actually went primarily into esports. And so we had this massive demand uptick in esports, and we had all of these really sort of immaculate looking websites prop up, and just the operations were amazing. They looked real. They felt real. Customer service was amazing. Like if you went there, you would think that this thing is a legit business. But they were running ghost matches. So things like they would pre-record some gameplay, advertise it as an actual tournament, and then offer odds on it. And that was happening so frequently, like unbelievably frequently. Like I can't express to you how frequently it was happening, and there was such a high volume of uneducated demand. So there was nobody's able to discern the difference, and so these people made a lot of money. In other words, and that's something that has receded now. That particular example, but what's continued to be pervasive is betting operators being maybe a little bit worried or intimidated by the prospect of esports and how best to deal with it and how best to frame it in a legal and licensed context. And unless in every jurisdiction there is a legal avenue to engage with esports betting, the eventuality, regardless of what you do, is that your citizens are going to go out and find some illegal operation that they can engage with. To your point about engaging on a minor's level, sort of on a minor level with like using skins as sort of a currency of sorts, and using tokens or crypto or something as a currency of sorts, absolutely have seen that. I think that is definitely not something that we see with licensed operators. It's not something that has ever been obvious to us with licensed operators. But definitely, we see platforms that allow you to go and sort of essentially trade in your virtual goods in order to be able to wager and bet. And in fact, there was a publisher recently embroiled in I wouldn't say a scandal, but it was on the verge of becoming one. And so, like for example, with the game like Roblox, I'm not sure, Sally, you've seen that issue come up. So with the game Roblox, some nefarious sort of third parties were utilizing the Roblox currency, when of course Roblox's primary demographic is like 14 to 18-year-old people. That's sort of the bulk of their player base. So some nefarious sort of third parties were using the platform in order to facilitate a casino marketplace of sorts, where you can actually utilize Roblox tokens and you can actually gamble on this casino site and then receive a reward. And the mechanism was sophisticated and it was well run, and it looked like, again, like it was purpose built, like almost it looked like it was like built for the game. So and in that situation, Roblox, we, for example, we engaged with Roblox in that particular situation, and they've made a series of really good decisions and a series of really good adjustments to fight and combat that. So it's both at the IP holder level that can eventuate, but it's all, but again, out in the industry. And when it's out in the industry, you're not going to have an IP holder be too interested in stepping in. It has to be the regulator and the law enforcement that comes down and sort of does something about it. But then how do you do something about somebody who's operating in Cyprus, for example? So but yeah, that's sort of the landscape at the moment for that level of betting.
So one of the main activities that your group does, as you mentioned off air before we started today, was a lot of work around data integration. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind articulating a little bit of what you're trying to build and what the data sources look like, as far as I can only imagine it's like drinking from a fire hose when it comes to these data sources.
Yeah, one of the main issues that I think we have, if we look at the esports, sort of the esports betting crossover, one of the main issues that we have is just so much data availability. And so when you want to create markets for betting purposes, you have so many options. Who died first, who got the first kill, who stepped on this pixel first. You can even get to that level of data. And so if you can think about the opportunities to create fixes on these prop bets or these extra markets that nobody will ever see, because it's not an outcome fix, it's a match event fix, right? So That is something that's like completely invisible at the moment. And a lot of jurisdictions, when they engage with esports betting, because they understand that nuance, or because they come to us and we help them understand the nuance of that data, they actually prohibit those types of bets because they understand that good luck policing, a fix on who killed what first. It's just almost impossible to do that. So what they do instead is just facilitate only primary market sort of outcomes on particular matches. Now, the work that we're doing, and interestingly, what the issue is with so much data availability is that there are legitimate ways to get the data and potentially less legitimate ways to get the data, or less advantageous ways to get the data. So we have official data on one hand and we have unofficial data on the other hand, and they're very, very different in the sense that, official data is generally done under a license with the intellectual property holder, and then you're pulling the data directly from the game engine in real time. And then you're passing that data on to your customers in real time with very minimal delay. Whereas with scrape data, you're essentially farming that data manually, whether it's having a bot watching a feed, a video feed, and farming the data off the video feed, or having a bot crawl over a website and sort of take the stats and take the data off the website, and then basically taking that, processing it, and then selling it on or passing it on to your customers as a data provider. Now, in the past, in the very early days when esports was a lot more nascent in the sense of its interaction with the gambling space, there wasn't as much of an appreciation for data availability as there was now, because frankly, there was no need. The publishers had the data, and the publishers were the ones generally that would put out information relating to the matches and so on. But as the industry has become more mature and realized that, well, people are just going to take the data anyway, and they're going to create odds from that data, and then they're going to sell the odds out into the market. There's been a bit more sophistication built into the industry, and more of a move towards official data. I mean, most recently, a data provider called Grid, run by a guy called Moritz over in Berlin, signed a deal with Ubisoft for Rainbow Six data at an official level. And so that's sort of part of the work that we're doing at the moment, helping people that are buying data or engaging with data in the esports industry to understand where that data comes from, if it's an official source or if it's an unofficial source, or if it's a mix of sorts. And I think that's like the most fundamental building block that you need in a data infrastructure, so that you have a proper schema for the industry to use. And nobody's taking guesses as, I'm going to supplier A, like I have no idea where they're getting their data, but they have a lot of clients, so we'll just buy it. And so, that also has other implications for integrity and things like that. But that's pretty much, where the data play is at the moment, unofficial versus official. It's that basic.
Do you monitor or have any engagement with consumers in terms of people watching the tournaments or people betting on the tournaments? And in terms of that, as you say, that reputation risk that, if they're having, multiple scandals, that this is going to tarnish the industry, even if it's in, CSGO, it'll tarnish, that these things, people often don't discriminate don't understand that ecosystem. So a scandal in one area will tarnish others. So I'm just wondering, for example, one of the questions from the audience is around CSGO Roll, sponsoring CSGO, which you can sign up without ID verification. So, people are concerned about underage gambling and the ability to bet in a risky manner without proper protections for problem gambler, people with gambling problems, who are gambling rather in a problematic way, or underage gambling. What that damage at the integrity and visibility and optics of esports is presumably something that's of concern.
Yeah, no, it's of concern, but you have to be aware of it to be concerned about it. And I think the issue that we have is that a lot of these stakeholders are not aware. Frankly, and again, this goes back to the idea of a lack of capability to commercialize successfully. If somebody's offering you sponsorship dollars, that's a lifeline, that's blood in the veins. And so it's very, very hard to then to then provide persuasive education that, well, no, hold on, you don't just take money from anyone. You need to do your due diligence, and actually, this is the level that you need to drill down to in order to have confidence that you're taking money from people that are good. that are doing things the right way or to best practice. And frankly, that's been a development recently. Recently, we've been sort of I don't know if appointed is the right word, but we've been referred to by Valve, to Valve being the publisher of CS:GO, to basically vet every single betting sponsor coming on to any Valve major. And so to be a betting sponsor sponsoring the Valve major, you have to go through ESIC, and ESIC needs to check your organization out and make sure that you go through an audit and you pass the audit before you're able to go through and actually sponsor the major. And that's something that is really positive. It's a very, very positive thing that Valve has done. And the reason why it's positive is because it's a blind spot. It's not core business for Valve to know this stuff. It's not core business for example, in the question referred to G2, which is a team. It's not necessarily core business for G2 to know how to ascertain this, but it's important that teams and publishers and other stakeholders, tournament operators and such, begin to go to experts, to work this stuff out, because of course all it takes is the observation of the malfeasance or the malpractice or whatever it may be to damage everything that they've built, right? So yeah, that's definitely something that's becoming more. And again, you have to remember that it's just only in March, like the leading publisher in esports, I would say, from an integrity perspective, began to allow people to talk to betting companies. So that's where we are, so we've now have to go from, we can now speak to them to work out who they are. And I'm not saying that Riot doesn't have protocols to work out who they are. I'm sure they do, but that becoming more pervasive across the industry, and becoming a standard practice that people do. When you take money from a betting operator or sort of a book, you check them, and this is how you check them. And we're in a position at the moment to lead that education and lead that way forward. And so we often find that a lot of people will engage with the entities that are listed on our website as anti-corruption supporters, for example, which is an interesting first step, but it's not necessarily what we endorse. We don't say that everybody on our website, you should go and engage with them, because all an anti-corruption supporter means is that they give us data so we can see it, so we can see the risk. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're a vetted operation and we've green lighted them to go and sort of engage with the industry. So that's an education piece on our part that we're working on at the moment to roll out into the industry, to get a little bit more maturity around the risks associated with coming into sponsorship agreements with these sort of types of entities.
So as you're talking, I just start thinking more and more about how if there was any single human activity to gamblify, this would be the sort of ideal one from a business perspective. Because you have incredible interest in sort of the core activity. You have this data that's generated continuously. You have sort of events that happen very frequently. You have an illusion of skill or some element of skill. How big is this market now, and what do you think that the TAM is of it? And you don't even have to define it in terms of numbers, but you could define it in sort of whatever involvement variable you think is relevant.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's a good question. There were a few different reports that all have different amounts of money attributed to market volume and things like that. Most recently, a report, I think by Statista, I forgot what the name of the publication was, but it was around 2.2 billion or 2.3 billion in 2023, up 870 odd mil from previous years. But the market size, I guess, the way that a lot of people misrepresent it is they look at the gaming market and they say the gaming market is the esports market, and so you end up with like this $400 billion industry where there's just so much money everywhere and so many people, but that's actually not the case at all. The esports market is a particular segment of the gaming market, and oftentimes has merely a crossover element with the gaming market. and is in fact, frankly, its own independent market with its own market pressures, both in supply and demand. And so the important thing to note with the trend overall is, the trend has been generally upwards in terms of both supply and demand of esports. But the issue that we're having is that funding is drying up. So, just sort of COVID, there was a lot of fuel on the fire, and now funding is drying up, at least in the Western world. We're having a much lower rate of investment in esports than we had in the past. And you're seeing a lot of the effect of that funding. A lot of consolidation is happening at the moment in esports. And so, although the market is there, the operators and the stakeholders within the market are now being consolidated. And we saw, for example, in the esports betting space, a lot of the esports only betting books, closed down after COVID, after receiving an artificial high of demand from COVID and building their operations on the back of that. Some that come to mind include like Luckbox, for example, which closed, pretty much mid-COVID, most recently Unicorn, which is a brand from Entain, which was wound down by Entain, who still offer esports, but just not under the Unicorn brand. And so you can see sort of, although we have market growth and a large market to play with, people are struggling to be successful in the commercial ventures, or they were just given too much money at too high a valuation at a time where demand optics may have been a little bit inflated because of the environment that the world was in. And so, we're seeing a correction now. Whether that correction turns into a downtrend and more of a sort of a depression in demand and a depression in market size, that's still to be seen. But I think consolidations in any market are always a healthy sign of maturity and growth. So we haven't really worked through that yet and come out the other side. It's still a work in progress. And most recently in October, as I said, that team selling for 17 million, that's just mind blowing. Down from 725 million. But yeah. So I mean,
are there any
sorry.
thoughts around regulation? I mean, who is responsible for, obviously we're talking a lot about integrity and data, and then there's the players, but then there's the grassroots players, and there's the spectators, and there's the people betting on the events. And I'm kind of coming back to that aspect of reducing risk, and there's so many different aspects of that, for obviously integrity, financial risk, but also for people who do experience difficulties controlling their gambling. A lot of the time now sports have sort of become involved in the message gamble responsibly, or they're at least aware of the impact of marketing. There's starting to be regulations on how much marketing you can have associated with sporting events. Is there any regulation, or who would even be able to regulate, advertising and the connection between gambling companies and esports? So,
yeah, look, I'm always a really strong advocate for self-regulation within the industry, if possible at all. The issue that we have, Sally, is as you're aware, how do you regulate something that happens so globally and so instantaneously all the time? So it's definitely a really odd one, and it's almost a wicked problem in the sense that if it's not team A, it's team B in jurisdiction X. It's so I think self-regulation is an excellent model. And again, we look at the superstructure, right? The superstructure is IP holder at the top, and so ultimately, regulation-wise, the IP holder needs to do something. It's their license, it's their product, it's their license into the tournament as well. And so, at least on the official side of gameplay, as it pertains to esports, the publishers are the ones that have the power to enforce a standard or a standard operating procedure or a way to engage with the betting industry. And we're seeing we're seeing the start of that with sort of how Riot's doing it at the moment, and we're also seeing an example of that with how Valve is doing it with ESIC, for example. So, you know, the very simple but probably insufficient answer is publishers need to have a very active role in any solution, as it relates to, you know, fundamentally relates to their intellectual property, and they of course are the ones that license all of the intellectual property into the entire ecosystem. So, you know, but I have seen on the flip side where that hasn't happened in certain jurisdictions, and the government has come in and been extremely heavy-handed, you know, with regulation, and so, you know, it's basically a we got to do it, or somebody else will just do it for you, and they'll do it the way that they see fit, which is never the best way. But yeah, that's where I think that's probably where the industry needs to progress and develop a little bit more is in that area of regulation, self-regulation for those particular risks.
So I have to ask this question. So I'm a researcher, Sally's a researcher. Harshu actually wrote in a question he presented last week on our seminar, and he's been doing some work in research on related topics. From your perspective, what can researchers contribute to this industry right now?
Yeah, really good question. So we're working on a platform called ESIC Insights at the moment. And ESIC Insights is our attempt to interface, to bring an interface between both academics and academics, researchers, and the industry. The industry hasn't been really, you know, actively engaging with academia in any particular identifiable way, and I think that that's to their detriment. And frankly, it's because they don't know how to engage, in what touch point to engage. And so, what we're trying to do at the first instance is create a place of meeting, or a platform where we can actually rationalize, you know, academic articles, journal articles into industry application, and provide that to the industry, so that they can have a point of contact with the leading research that's coming out of all these different journals. You know, so that is the start of an initiative, which also includes within it, you know, our attempt to aggregate data points for the purposes of research, so that you know, researchers have access to the data they need in order to inform the industry of what it needs. Because when you're in an industry that's so data rich, you often drown in data, and you can't make any sort of or any meaningful sense of it as in a longitudinal format. You know, you're looking at the here and now, the event as it is today, and then after the event dies, you're looking at the next event, you know, and so on and so forth. So I think, you know, at a macro level, what we're doing with building the Insights platform and sort of bringing data in and bringing, you know, academic, you know, the academic side in and bringing the industry side in, is we're going to be able to have a really good meeting place to develop that exact thought, and to sort of explore how best to apply, you know, the cross section between industry and academia. So, short answer, we'll see. But I think at the first point of contact is bringing everybody together and sort of having a place where industry can understand there's value there and then engage with it. So, for example, really quickly, just to conclude the point, I've had, you know, many members that have come up to us and said, like, how do we find out if this is an actual thing? Like, how do we research whether our approach here is correct? How do we establish it in fact? And I've said, well, have you commissioned a study? Like, have you? And it's just so far, because you got to remember these entities are generally entertainment companies. Like, they're not thinking, you know, do a study and sort of have an outcome and produce something that, you know, is tangible and physical. Even for us, like what we're moving towards now is, you know, a regular annual study, clinical study for doping purposes for esports, so that we can actually produce, you know, a clinical study outcome that you know, accentuates and also evidences our approach to doping. So these are the sort of areas of maturity that are needed in the industry, so that we can have the infrastructure that we need to, you know, depend and support our conclusions that we're arriving at, so that we're not just experimenting constantly with what we have.
And just to close the loop there, is there a link we can pop in the show notes to find out more about this?
Yeah, not just yet, but in the coming months there will be.
All right.
Not just
So
yet.
keep an eye on your LinkedIn profile and the ESIC website. Well, then the other question I have around that is we have a lot of people listening in who do provide treatment or work in community organisations. So they might be interfacing with people who are concerned about, if their kids are playing esports or if people are gambling on esports and presenting for treatment. Is there any information or resourcing available around how to engage in esports, either as a player, a consumer, or someone who wants to bet on it in, the safest way possible?
Yeah, look, we do have a whole set of resources available. They're not available at the moment publicly on the website because they're being moved to a new site called fairplay.gg, which is going to be our learning management system, which will have our short courses on anti-corruption and all that sort of stuff. They'll be launching in the next month or so. But if in the meantime, people can get in contact with us on our website via our Contact Us section, and then we'll be able to provide them with those resources, generally delivered in a PDF format, so it's easily accessible. So yeah, definitely have the material there.
Now, before we wrap today, I guess want to basically give you the mic. And is there anything in particular that you want to draw our viewers' attention to? The sort of burning issues for your organization, or you in particular, that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, look, I think for us, I mean the model that we operate in is a really interesting one. We're a not-for-profit organization, and the way that we're funded and all of our activity is funded is through membership fees that come from stakeholders. And so, for us, what we're doing at the moment is making sure that we're revisiting the way that we model this organization from a funding perspective. And what we're finding is that there is an insufficient burden at the moment being placed on the betting stakeholders, which are creating a lot of the risk, right? And so for us, as we look to interface with people in the academic world and people in sort of government and regulators and law enforcement, we're looking to form meaningful connections. So meaningful connections basically leads to the point that I'm making to the audience. Reach out if you have a question about esports. Have a chat if you feel like there's some sort of value that you can add. We're always open to hearing thoughts, ideas, and sort of working with people that are interested and genuinely motivated to build the industry's infrastructure. Because that's something that obviously we've been doing for a long time and thankfully doing a decent job of so far. So probably the concluding thought would just be, if at all curious, feel free to reach out and we can have a chat and discuss how we could work together and support each other.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. It's been actually a really fascinating conversation, and this is something that I think everyone will really enjoy and revisit. So really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise. Now, are you happy for people to contact you on LinkedIn, or if you like, you can pop a contact email in the YouTube chat when you're available?
Yeah, no worries. People can definitely reach out on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to contact me. My email inbox is atrocious, so let's put that aside for a second. So, but yeah, definitely keen to chat with anybody that's interested. But on my end as well, thank you both for having me. It's been really interesting on my end as well. And sorry you had to listen to so much of my voice in one go. But hopefully it wasn't too bad.
Yeah, it was excellent to get into the details. I usually only allow Kahlil one technical question, but it was so fascinating. I had to hear all the details of it as well. So hopefully everyone stuck through and we all learned a lot. And that's it for season 4. Kahlil, we never intended it to go like this. I think we started this during COVID to keep ourselves and other people entertained, but it's continues to be fun.
Yeah, it's been, I think, the fact that it's gone on every single season, even including the first season, has been a surprise to us, but a very good one. And it's been a great way to connect with you and a bunch of other people in the community, and very bright people that I didn't know, like Stephen as well. So it's been such a wonderful journey so far and a great season as well.
Yes. And if you are watching, if you would like a season 5, where can be probably dragged back kicking and screaming if we can get a good lineup. So if you would like to see anyone in particular featured or any topics featured, please shoot us an email. Our inbox is manageable. We're usually contactable via email. Please pop us an email and let us know what you would like to see. And if we get enough content, then perhaps there may be season 5 as well. But for now, wishing everyone, happy holidays for the approaching holiday season, and thanks for sticking with us for season 4. If you haven't watched all of our past webinars, they're still pretty relevant, so go back through the catalogue in your downtime. But otherwise, looking forward to seeing everyone in the future.